but offices in Toaster in South Northampton. It's great. We've got a really good turnout here today, so hopefully we've got some weighty stuff to get through, and hopefully we're going to have some really good conversations. So welcome. So we'll go through the agenda. Apologies for absence. We've got various apologies. I don't think I'll note them all, but I know we've had them pre-submitted, haven't we, Charles? So we'll move on to item 2, notification of requests to address the meeting from public. We've not had any received. Item 3, declarations of interests. Just to remind everybody, it's important that we declare what we need to that hasn't been declared elsewhere. I won't read out the whole couple of paragraphs, but if there's any declarations of interest, if you could make them known. And indeed, as we go through the meeting, through the items. So item 4, chairman's announcements. Just to welcome some new members of the board from the retirement of Assistant Chief Constable Pauline Sturman. Chief Superintendent Ashley Tuckley will be the Northamptonshire Police representative on the board. Due to annual leave, Ashley is unable to attend this meeting though. Chris Kiernan joins us as the new Director for Children's Services in West Northants, replacing Kathy Hadley, and Sally Burns is our new Interim Director of Public Health for West Northamptonshire, replacing Lucy, and Sally's on my right here. So it's great to see Sally here today. So welcome. It's good to see Neelam as well, who's here at our first meeting, and Olivia as well, representing the Children's Trust as well. And I think all other colleagues we've seen you all a few times now. I'd also want to make a point of noting and recording thanks to Lucy as well, who's moving on. I think it's important that we acknowledge the contribution Lucy's made over quite a number of years now, and I'll ask Cheryl if we can write a letter on behalf of the board and just send that formally to Lucy, just to note note and vote, and record our thanks and appreciation, and wish her luck for future endeavours down in Essex. Any other announcements? I just wanted to say it's to me, from where I sit in my role within West Northants, I think we're at a really exciting point with the journey, especially through the ICP and some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. Because to me, as a locally elected representative, we're talking about things happening within our communities that add and help with a bigger picture strategically, and that really resonates with me and where we are, and I really want to advocate and champion that amongst my member colleagues as well, and we've got some plans to do that at the council. So just to thank everybody for their interest, and we'll move on through the agenda. So thank you. So item 5, minutes of the last meeting held on the 9th of December. Can I just ask the board to formally approve the minutes from the previous meeting? And if there are any issues, I'm sure we've had a chance really to pick them up, but are we happy to approve those minutes? Thank you. So we'll move on to the action log to review the actions from the previous meeting. I know this has all been circulated. Is there anything that anybody would like to pick up on the action log that needs attention? Sally?
Yeah, Chair, you'll remember that Lucy presented her Director of Public Health report at the last meeting, and the report sort of focused on the lessons learned during the pandemic over the last 2 years. In consultation with the chairs of both boards, what's been agreed or suggested is that the time period that report covers is now a 2-year period. So we're just making adjustments to the data in the document, and what we will do is bring it back to this board at the next meeting just for noting, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the last things I did with Lucy was to have a conversation to make sure we were happy with that, and it seems a sensible thing to do given everything else that's been happening. So the other ambers on the action points have been deferred until the 23rd of June. So is everybody happy that we move on from the action log? Thank you. So we'll go into item 10, if that's okay, because Nisha's kindly joining us from home on the screen because I think she's having to stay at home for COVID reasons. So can Nisha join us for item 10, if it's okay to move that forward, which is the Integrated Care System Outcome Framework. And we've got a verbal report from Nisha.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping it's going to be just to do a check
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very, very much for having me this afternoon. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think this is preferable to the alternative passing COVID amongst you all. So I'm here today on behalf of the Media Department to talk about the
Okay. We didn't plan for this. Do we have a plan B? Yeah, yeah.
I think, Chair, if I may, it would be helpful if we can't get Nisha on for us possibly to defer this item, because I think we won't do it justice if we don't have an opportunity for somebody like Nisha, who's been in and around the development of this, to kind of take it through in detail. So unless we can get Nisha back on.
Well, let's give it a couple of minutes. Obviously, she's lost contact, hasn't she? Which is a shame, because I know she'd been holding on for the beginning of the meeting. Okay, well, while we're waiting, let's give it a chance. Shall we move on to the COVID-19 update? And Sally could do the first part about the data and where we are. Then I think Toby's going to speak briefly about the vaccinations.
Yeah, okay, so just quickly, so I just wanted to update you on the sort of latest COVID-19 situation, and also just give you a bit of an update in light of the amendments that came out last week. So first of all, the data that I have is to the sort of 25th of February. The good news is that we're seeing a rapid sort of decline in the number of cases in West Northamptonshire. The level this morning, actually, I did have a quick look at it, is 420 per 100,000. So it's really reducing. Northampton is slightly higher, but that would be to be expected with it being a more populated area. We are still slightly ahead of the National and East Midlands levels, but we were behind them in the way that our numbers went up. So again, that's nothing concerning. As you would expect, the number of lateral flows and the number of PCR tests are rapidly going down as well. And the good news is that the positivity in the PCR tests is also reducing. So, really, really good signs. Toby's going to update on the vaccination levels. I just wanted to quickly cover the announcements that came out last week and just go through what that means for us as a system. So obviously everyone will be aware that from last week, the need to self-isolate following a positive test was removed. The statutory need to do that. The advice, the practical advice is still there, so still there for people to isolate for 5 days and take two negative tests. There was an end to self-isolation payments, and a lot of the regulations around the pandemic were revoked as well. And then from the 1st of April, the use of COVID passes will no longer be recommended in certain venues, no longer the free symptomatic testing, and guidance is sort of flooding out on how we deal with this at the moment. What does that mean for us? Where are we? So we're basically in a bit of a period of transition. We need to step down the huge response that was there, but we need to do it in a careful way and make sure that we're sort of dealing with any risks, basically. And as I said, guidance is still flying out on this, so it's a bit of a sort of managed retreat. And there's a lot of learning from the last 2 years that we can take and build on. So just in terms of health protection and infection prevention control, just to reassure everyone, obviously we've got really strong local procedures in place. So any local outbreaks and any incidents will continue to be managed by the teams that we've got. We've got a single point of contact in place advising educational establishments with the changes as the guidance emerges. And we've got a similar situation in place in care settings. So, giving them advice, guidance, training, and our environmental health officers are also still providing advice to workplace settings. So, people have still got a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. Testing is still happening at the moment. The site here, when I walked in, it was still people coming through it. But that is going to end in April. There will be further guidance on testing in, vulnerable locations and things, and we're awaiting and preparing for that at the moment. And then the last thing that I just wanted to mention is we have been updating the communications on the system. I think what we need to do is sort of change the tone so it's very positive about, supporting residents to live with COVID and also supporting them to sort of improve their health and well-being as well, and just try and, reduce that anxiety that people have still got. But really happy to bring a further update to the next meeting, Chair, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sally.
I think Toby's going to update on vaccination.
Sure. Should we just ask if there's any questions for Sally first on any of that? Joe?
So, sorry, thank you for the update. I think one of the things that I wanted particularly to bring into this arena is the situation with regard to people attending health facilities has not changed, and that maintains in place. There is obviously some question about how that will move forwards, but I think there is a lot of confusion amongst the general public and quite a lot of challenge and unfortunately a return of the aggression that actually had started to settle when the general public are challenged with regard to use of face coverings, and obviously in health settings staff are still restricted, and that then has an impact on the workforce as well, because nothing has changed. But I think it's both from the point of view of staff within our system, but also the general public. I think that information is not well known and potentially causes difficulties in those scenarios.
Yeah, and I think we need to pick that up through the communications that are going out, don't we, and really sort of emphasize that as well. So I'll take that back as an action. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to Toby, if that's okay, Toby.
Yep, thank you. I might just make a couple of follow-on comments to the previous item, and then turn to the back side of things, and just building on Joe's piece. I guess it is a tricky place for instance, isn't it? Because it's just a reminder that COVID's still with us. I mean, I know Nisha is at home isolating at the moment, and I don't know about anyone else around the room, but I feel like I know more people at the moment who've had it in the last couple of weeks, and actually quite a few people who are double jabbed and boosted who've still been quite knocked out by it. And we were looking at Anna, because we were with one of our chief exec colleagues last night, who was still sounding pretty groggy a couple of week or two after being in that place. So just a bit of a reminder, our acute hospitals have still got 90 or so COVID positive patients in them at any one point in time at the moment. I know your facilities, David, no doubt, NHFT, some similar things. So we're rightly moving into a very different phase of this, and the general public and outside feels very different. As you say, Joe, actually a lot of our healthcare facilities at the moment are still rightly operating in line with that same set of guidance. So we'll just need to be sensitive to how that's managed over the coming days and weeks. On the Vax Programme side of things, Chris Paolo, who heads up our Vax Programme, wasn't able to be with us today. So I agreed just to give a brief verbal update on where we're at programme-wise. Just a few headline numbers on this, and of course this continues to be one of the big success stories nationally that has got us to the place that we're in, thankfully, with all of this. To date, as of last night, we have across the county collectively delivered 1,480,288 jabs through a whole series of different settings. That includes first, seconds, and boosters, and fourths also for some more vulnerable groups. In terms of the kind of delivery modes across that, primary care networks have continued to be, so our general practice sites, the single biggest delivery source for all of that, about 790,000 vaccinations delivered through our GP primary care network sites. But community pharmacies now, which we've extended the number of those involved in the vaccination programme, delivering 25,000 of those vaccinations to date as well. And the large vaccination centre that we continue to run at Moulton Park is our kind of big facility within the county, slowed down significantly in the moment, but it's still there, and we've extended the lease on that for another 12 months on the basis of we'd rather have capacity within the system if we need it as we go forwards. In terms of kind of progress around particularly the booster programme, we've delivered 560,000 boosters jabs across the county, and that does mean that about 82% of the eligible population to be boosted has received the booster jab to date, which is great, and it's again a marker of how we've been able as a country and as a county to move to where we are at the moment. Current focus of the programme really on 5 areas. Increasing booster uptake in all eligible cohorts. 81% is great, but that still means 19% haven't, and that's still a big number when you put it across the county. So anything we can do through our various channels to continue to emphasise the importance of coming forwards. Also, though, alongside that, completing second doses for 12 to 15-year-olds, mainly through schools, increasing the uptake of first doses in 5 to 11s and at-risk cohorts. And then 2 areas that we've kind of focusing on that we know have been particularly kind of problematic in terms of getting higher levels of uptake. So kind of 4th area of focus at the moment on low uptake areas in the community, where we've got mobile units and mobile vaccination programs running really to try and kind of boost the uptake there. And 5th and finally, in terms of women who are pregnant, where again we've seen for all sorts of reasons that others will have picked up from a media and social media point of view, the concerns there around vaccination and pregnancy that have impacted on uptake levels. So the programme is still live. It's significantly kind of lower in terms of running levels. So at the moment we're doing sort of 600 or so vaccinations a day. Just pre-Christmas in that really big ramp up fortnight, we were up at sort of 15,000 a day. So you can see that we're very much at a stage of the programme that's kind of really trying to complete the rollout to some of those areas. At the same time, though, we are now starting to plan looking forwards across the rest of the year. So we are working up in line with national arrangements for springtime booster programmes for age cohort groups that are still being finalised at the moment, and also anticipating the likelihood probably of an autumn campaign as well. Details of that still to be confirmed. And alongside that, one of the reasons we're retaining the capacity around our large vaccination centre in particular is if, heaven forbid, we do enter back into further variant territory that isn't responsive to current vaccinations sufficiently, we obviously need to make sure that we've got the capability in the county to step that back up again as well. But final comment I would just make is to put on record to my thanks to a whole host of partners around this table in lots of different ways who've played a major contribution to the success of that programme to date, but a reminder that it's still with us, and I think in part of that, learning to live with vaccinations in this area are going to be a thing with us for some time to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Are there any points or questions for Toby on the vaccination? Stuart?
Thanks, Chair. It's more just an addition, really. So it's just to advise the board that we have had confirmation that the government has repealed the requirement for mandatory vaccination in care settings now. Nationally, that equates to some 40,000 care workers who were dismissed from their roles because they didn't agree to take on board vaccination. It's going to be a busy time, we envisage, probably through employment tribunals, and there is likely to be an effect locally. From an adult social care perspective, whilst we would always advocate the vaccination of frontline care workers as it reduces transmission effectively within care homes, it does take a bit of the strain off in relation to what is quite a fragile social care workforce at the moment. So that's just for noting, please, Chair.
Thank you, Stuart. And finally, we've got David to give us an update on the mandatory NHS situation, if required. Yeah.
So, 1st of March, I think we had a
Thank you. So I just want to echo Toby's point around our thanks to Chris and his staff. He's done a fantastic job, but part of that has been the contribution from partners as well. And, you know, hopefully we won't need to ramp it up again, but at least we've got the infrastructure and relationships and everything else in place to do that if we need to. So are we happy to note the verbal reports we've had there? Thank you. So we'll move on to item 8, which is the integrated care system. So we've got Naomi to give us an update on the first section, if that's okay. Thank you.
Tedious, but I think the end game is extraordinarily important. There are 4 aims of integrated care systems: improving health for all, reducing health inequalities, good use of public money, and the 4th aim is what can the NHS and indeed local government contribute as anchor institutions to the health and well-being and economic development of where we live. And I always feel that Northamptonshire, unlike some of the other ICSs, has an enormous advantage in that we're 2 unitary authorities and we are a geographical area that is recognized by our population as a place, you know, as something that they relate to. I live in Milton Keynes. The ICS that I'm involved in is Milton Keynes, Bedfordshire, and Luton. And we were all completely puzzled by it and still are puzzled by it. So it is a massive advantage that we can have a commitment to our population and understand our population and help communicate this to our population. Where we are on the integrated care board side is that we were meant to be a statutory organization by the 1st of April. That got moved to the 1st of July. There was some rumors that it might get moved again because of debates in the House of Lords on the bill, but it looks like it's going to go through. I mean, the last assurance I've had was pretty certain about 1st of July, which is very, very good news. We really want to get it going. Where we are in terms of setting up the integrated care board, which is the statutory body which will have the main control of what's going on, is that we are appointing 4 non-executive directors. 3 non-executive directors are already appointed, and we're appointing 4 executive leads, and we're setting up the committee structure underneath the board that will basically be the engine room. I think it's important to say that setting up all these, because it's a new organization, and it's not just a new organization, it's a new organization in a format that hasn't happened before. I've been really pushing on Toby and my other colleagues to make the new committees, the terms of reference, relatively flexible so that if it isn't working, we can iterate it and, you know, try to reconfigure, because we haven't done this before. And it's very, very important that we don't set in stone. And the other thing I always feel like when you're setting up a new structure, you argue for the structure you want, and some arguments win out and some arguments don't, but you don't do the thinking and the risk analysis of, well, we went for this because it was the best option, but the arguments against it were these, and we have to just risk analysis on that. So it's that kind of work that we're sort of in the weeds of right now. But I think once we get it going, we're expecting to set up in shadow form in April, so that our new board will have its first meeting in shadow form in April. We will take over the formal legal and safe responsibilities from the CCG on the 1st of July. And my thanks go to Joe in helping me understand what a CCG does, because when I agreed to be chair of the NHCP, it didn't occur to me that I was going to be chair of this bigger statutory organization that has the CCG. I suppose the one other thing I want to say, which is in terms of, Nisha's back, which is brilliant, because I wanted Nisha to hear what I wanted to say about the notion about an outcomes framework. The government published a white paper on integrated care a few weeks ago. I don't know if you've had a look. It's in your papers. It's actually not too bad. As government white papers go, it's pretty legible and it's not too long, and it's worth a read. But what I was delighted about in the white paper is how much it emphasized the importance of an outcomes framework. And the reason that an outcomes framework is important for what we're doing is, well, it's twofold. One is that for the first time, I'm pretty sure in governance terms, for the first time, local government will have a formal seat at the table in a governance arrangement for NHS spend. So having Anna and having Rob as members of the Integrated Care Board means that they will be participating in the decisions on how the NHS money is spent. This hasn't happened before, and I think it's very radical, and I think people aren't talking enough about how radical it is. And I urge you to use the power. You know, I think those considerations about health for all and how we reduce health inequalities are vitally important, and we can't reduce health inequalities without the major role that's played by local government. And I think Stuart's going to talk more about that when he talks about the ICP. So one of the things that the new arrangements are meant to do is remove the internal competition within the National Health Service. So no longer are we about purchasers and providers who are opposition to each other and in competition with each other. We are about a corporate group working together for the welfare of the population. Now, what that means is that all the arguments made on the board will need to be about not what's best for local government or indeed what's best for the hospital or what's best for GPs. It has to be about what's best for the population of Northamptonshire. The outcomes framework is what we need to sign up to say these are our key priorities for the population of Northamptonshire. So it's vitally important, and I'm really pleased that this is really stressed in the integration white paper about how important it is to have an outcomes framework. And a life cycle approach is saying, well, for children, these are the three things that are most important that will really ensure their futures. For working age people, these are the people that are going to, prevent them being frail elderly. And of course, for elderly people, these are things that are going to prevent them from falling. So from one extreme of low birth weight babies to falls prevention, that's what an outcomes framework looks like. It means that across the life cycle, you're trying to prevent the next decline. And I think that once we all sign up to that, it means some of the things that are our pet things go, and some of the things that we're not that keen on go, but it's a combination of the kind of work that Lucy and Nisha do on the data. What does the data tell us for Northamptonshire? A combination of what government tells us we have to do, because government is right now incredibly keen on elective care. They're also very worried about obesity in children. So we have the ones that are given to us, but we have the ones that we choose ourselves because this is what the data for Northamptonshire says. But we also need to listen to our public on what concerns them the most. And I have to say, in my long experience, it's often not the same thing. So those negotiations between what the data says, what our gut tells us, and what people tell us is how you make up an outcomes framework. And I think it's vitally important for the Integrated Care Board to be able to make its decisions based on that, not based on what's good for my component part of, but good for the people of Northamptonshire. We will be operating in shadow form from April. We begin to operate as a safe and legal organization, I hope, from the 1st of July. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Are there any questions or points, Anna?
Thank you. I think Naomi makes a very good point, and I know Nisha didn't get to present. I think we have a challenge on our hands around those of us that have seen the outcomes framework between the the need to have empirical and academic kind of evidence of things that tells us from a, life and determinants point of view, things getting better. And what really does matter on the ground to people in our place. And I think the work, which I know Stuart will go through in a minute, about how you think about place and what we do, will find itself at odds at times with that outcomes framework. And I think we've got to think about how people view it, and how we view kind of the needs of the community. I'm not saying it's wrong in any way, but I think it's a challenge, because I think most people who look at that framework will think, well, what does that really mean to me? A few will recognise points on it, as you said, but not all. And I think we'll have to keep treading that careful line between academic and empirical, and outcomes for people's well-being and feeling better and happier.
Thank you, Anna. Joe?
Thank you. I think the other thing to say is that we don't need to wait for the 1st of July. I would be very keen to say that we do need to start making these changes now. These are things we've all discussed together on a number of times, and there is no need to wait. And obviously we will use the CCG statutory mechanisms until the ICB has statutory mechanisms, but there is no reason for us to delay. So anybody thinks, oh, we'll just leave it till authorization date, I would encourage people to say, let's go with the things that we're already doing, and let's not lose any time. Our population needs it, and particularly from a health inequalities point of view, we're coming out of COVID in not the best shape. We really don't have any time to waste on this, so we will do everything we can to support that continued change.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, and on Naomi's point around the geography, I've mentioned to colleagues, my member colleagues in Western France, that I've been on some different courses and sessions on the ICSs, and exactly as you said, some of the geographies are very strange. You could say, to be polite, and we've got an opportunity, and Anna often reminds us that our opportunity is that we're one. We're Northamptonshire. That's a place we recognise, and we've got to try and keep that as opposed to maybe being subsumed if it doesn't quite work out into one of these complicated geographies.
If you don't, can I tell one story about that dissonance between what we want people to want and what they want? And apologies, it's a great story. It goes back to my Sure Start days when we had money to give out for young children, those happy days. But we had a requirement on the plans that they had to talk to local people about what they wanted out of the program. And we had a test about whether they talked to local people when we saw the plans. And the test was dog poo. Because when the plans came back and we spoke to local people and they said they wanted more health visitors and speech therapists, we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. The plans that came back and said, we want the park cleaned up. We're bothered about the broken glass. We don't like, the very poor people who were involved in Sure Start were much more concerned about their physical environment than they were about services. And just understanding that, which does not mean that's part of your outcomes framework, but it tells you so much about how important it is to tie whatever we're doing to real lives.
And that, I think, is the beauty of the ICP and how we can achieve that. Toby.
Yes.
Sorry, Neelam. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think just leading from the point Naomi is making, and my point is more around utilizing the opportunity. So while government is giving the elective care focus from government, I think we mustn't miss out on the opportunity to engage with the public, the job log, because as Joe said, we are coming out of the COVID situation. There are a lot of challenges, and I think we must try our best to engage with the job log, the public, now that there is a new beginning and new way of working. Yeah.
Thank you. David.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick points, just building on that. You're absolutely right on the elective piece and engaging. It's interesting as well. One of the big strands around the outcome framework is the focus on health inequalities, not just the overall kind of population health piece. And therefore, when we look at areas of work like our elective work, we know we've got massive backlogs that are built over the last period in terms of elective waiting lists. and that differentially impacts on different populations and different communities across the county. So again, with some of our public health team input, we're really starting with the acute trusts in particular to look underneath that to make sure that what we're doing is not just exacerbating those inequalities that we know exist and have been amplified through COVID. Two quick thoughts also on the build piece that Naomi described. There is inevitably a lot of focus at the minute on governance and setup and organisational things, and local authority colleagues in the room who've been through that process in the last 2 years will understand that journey. There's just some stuff that has to happen. Really, really important though that at the same time we're keeping an absolute focus on some of the big priorities that need to move forwards, and the collaborative work that we talk about in terms of our work around mental health, learning disability and autism, the elective work, the children and young people's work, and the ICANN work. Those things are absolutely at the front of our minds in terms of keeping moving forwards with them, because that's kind of the real work as opposed to the organisational bit that supports it. And then my last piece, and this might be something we want to pick up with local authority colleagues a bit going forward as well. There is a real neatness and a beauty to Northamptonshire in terms of the scale of that from an ICS point of view, particularly compared to some other parts of the country. The flip side to that is we are relatively small in ICS scale compared to some of the other 41 parts of the country. So Naomi and I have started a dialogue with some of our colleagues across the East Midlands, looking at some of those things that might make sense actually to do on a larger geography across the East Midlands, particularly from a health perspective. But I'm mindful as well that local government will have your own networks and relationships with other colleagues across geographies, and that's something we might, particularly from a Midlands point of view, we start looking at East and West Midlands footprints to want to think about some of those areas as well potentially. So yes, a focus at place, yes, a focus at Northamptonshire wide, but also there will be some things that are sensible to do, particularly more specialised things across health service, kind of commissioning and planning across the East Midlands.
Thank you, Tam. Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? We are plugged in, certainly from a member level with the East Midlands, and there's meetings that I'm sure Jonathan attends. So it'd be interesting to hear how that develops and whether we can add anything. Okay, shall we go back to Nisha to talk about the outcome framework? Are you happy with that, Naomi? Yeah, because it links into really well. So Nisha, welcome back, and let's have another go.
Thank you very much. Cheryl, are you screen sharing? Oh, that's pretty helpful. I hope it's works better this time then. Just for your reference, I presented that already from only at the end. I was talking to myself. The outcomes framework piece of work has been a few months in development, and what we're hoping it will do is allow us to galvanise a strategy in future around it, that's going to be a kind of key requirement of us in next year in terms of development. Cheryl, if you could go on to slide 2, please. Thank you. So what we were asked to do was to work in a really objective way, using a life course approach to determine the kinds of things that seem to be the most important appointments of us in Northamptonshire. So we've identified the things where we have significantly poorer performance than our peers, whether that's compared with a national mark or a regional one. And what we ended up with was a very, very long list of things. And we didn't think that it was going to be possible to do all 120 plus places on this list that we originally compiled. So this presentation is a way for me to describe the approach that we've taken in distilling out the kind of key priorities that we have tried to articulate for Northamptonshire for next year, but also describe a methodology that we may want to build on so that we get better and better at this as we go through our PCS development. Let's get going on then, Cheryl. What we've done is have a look at the wide range of health care data to create a very long list. We've then been through a period of prioritising those things with our collaboratives and clinicians and people who know and are actively involved in developing and delivering work around those subject areas. And then we've had a period where we've tested that across our system. And I think we're now in that final stage of developing this outcome framework for Northamptonshire. So how have we done that? Sharon, if you could flip to the next slide. We've had to look at a whole load of healthcare data, so whether that's running air, things that we're used to seeing, but also importantly, care. So we looked at the adult social care outcomes framework, the children's equivalent, and a number of different data sources from the health. Now, this isn't the way that we would want to do things in future. We're investing quite a lot of time and effort in improving our data analytic systems. So this is a best endeavours approach for this year based on what was currently available to us at the moment. We can go on. What we found was 120 plus things. We tried to allocate those into life courses. So we've decided that those would be around start well, live well, be well. So start well, being everything from pre-pregnancy through to 18 years of age. Live well being those adult years, and age well being for the adult. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what happened to diabetes? Or there could be other categorizations we could use. Well, we haven't necessarily found things that have floated to the top of the pile of things that we need to address in Northamptonshire around death as such. So we haven't necessarily needed a separate life stage of that, but it would be a big challenge if people kind of had figures aren't the only things that we want to consider either now or in future. We'll try to then look at some of the thematic areas, the opportunities and spectrum, and we've done it in a way that we look at.
Hi, Nisha. Sorry to bother you. I wonder if you could maybe try and switch your... Hi, Nisha. Can you hear us? Hello? Can you hear us? I'm wondering if you could just switch your video off, because we're hearing a bit of intermittent distortion. There you go. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, let's have a go from there.
I hope that's better.
Yeah.
Okay. If we can go on to the slide, Cheryl. So even after we did that, we needed to do a methodology by which we could prioritise all those things. So we looked to Manchester, who had successfully done it in an area, and we need to go for us.
Hi, Nisha. Sorry to bother you. Hello, Nisha. Hi, Nisha. I don't think we're able to do this justice because the quality of the sound is really poor, and it's a really important item, isn't it? So I think we're going to have to defer it and bring it back in June, if that's okay. And I'm, admire your persistence, and thank you for trying, but I don't think it's quite working out. Is everybody happy if we bring it back in June? And just thank Nisha for her efforts, but due to technology, it's just not quite working out. And I see your message. Thank you. So, shall we go back to where we were? Was there anything further you wanted to add, Naomi, from your section? Yeah, thank you. And Stuart, next.
Thank you. Cheryl, would you mind putting the slide set up, please? Apologies, this slide set will be circulated around the board. Our thinking around this is moving at pace. It's a bit like a rabbit hole when you get into it. The nuances and uniqueness of place start to throw up whole hosts of opportunities, but also challenges in relation to our aspirations around how we take some of this stuff forward. So we've got a slide set that I just want to kind of take you through. Could you stick it on slideshow for me, please, Cheryl? Excellent. So if you could go to the first slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about integrated care partnerships, but I'm going to hopefully talk quite a bit about place. because I think when we start to get into the conversations around place, sorry, Toby, but it moves us away from the kind of committee conversations to actually what does some of this stuff look like in reality, and how actually is it going to make a difference for local people. Before we kind of get into that, some of that exciting stuff, it's just helpful to kind of remind people around the role and the function of integrated care partnerships. Before I do that, I do want to welcome some of my colleagues from our health and wellbeing forums. We've invited you to kind of come along to the board today because through this kind of presentation, we look to really affirm the role of what were our previous health and wellbeing forums in the context of our localities. It would be helpful to you to be party and to contribute to some of the discussions. So thank you for joining us in person and some of the people on the call. So from an integrated care partnership perspective, ICPs are required to develop an integrated care strategy to address the broad health and social care needs of the population within an ICP's area, including determinants of health such as employment, environment and housing issues. ICBs and local authorities will be required by law to have regard to an ICP strategy when making decisions around commissioning and delivering services. That is a nice bureaucratic, government-orientated piece of language. For us locally, what this means is that within our ICS, we will have a single integrated care partnership. It will have a responsibility to produce a single integrated care strategy. That strategy will, in effect, bring together the work of our two health and wellbeing boards alongside the work of the activity our collaboratives take forward, so that we've got a coherent strategy around how we're looking to improve the lives of children, young people and adults locally. Making that a reality means we don't want to create meetings for meeting's sake, but we really do need to have that opportunity to bring together the really good practice that we will see play out in both of our places, to have an opportunity to share, to learn from each other, and to ensure, as I've mentioned, that we have a coherent delivery of services for local people. In that context, we're proposing that our local ICP will meet twice a year. Rather than it being simply orientated around a formal board, we're proposing that those two meetings a year will actually be probably conference style. In that context, we will be looking to invite the membership of both of the health and wellbeing boards alongside colleagues who sit on the integrated care board to give us a really rounded membership to our ICP. That will, through a conference style, mean that twice a year we can really bring together some of the challenges that we face within our communities and neighbourhoods, but also that opportunity to celebrate innovation and good practice. So sitting under that ICP, as I've mentioned, there are our two health and wellbeing boards. So I'm going to talk to you specifically around our thoughts and plans in relation to West Northants Health and Wellbeing boards, and I'm going to talk to you about how we've taken forward our thinking in and around place. What I can say is, really helpfully, my colleagues over in the north are taking forward comparable approaches, which means for colleagues in the room who operate on a county-wide footprint, there should be a level of commonality the way that you are engaging with place, which I think should mitigate concerns which have previously been raised around both places actually separating off into really unique places in that sense. So the first thing in and around this is about how we connect to our local people. Anna made some really vital comments around the fit with the kind of outcomes framework and what that means for local people. If you look on the slide set that you've got in front of you, you've got ICPs, ICBs, ICS. Integration, I think, is mentioned at least 6 times within that single slide set. If we go out and speak to people in our communities, they will not buy into this. Equally, the notion of care in this language, I think, simply orientates this around care. When you actually look at the structure around integrated care partnerships, it's much bigger than that. It's really orientated around wider determinants of health. It's really orientated around those things that some of us take for granted, which on a day-to-day basis enable us to kind of live our best lives. So in that context, next slide, please, Cheryl. One of the first things that we've started to do is to try and reframe some of this stuff into a language that local people can start to connect to. So we've had 2 health and wellbeing workshops, which have led to the development of our thinking, our thoughts to date in and around this. And in that context, we're putting forward that as we move forward the Health and Wellbeing Board, we start to orientate this around how we enable children, young people and adults within our neighbourhoods to live their best life. In order to live your best life, what we've started to set out are in effect 10 domains. And those domains are as holistic as they come. They range from how do we support every child to have a childhood that's thriving? How do we support access to the best available education and learning? How do we enable people to have an opportunity to be fit, well and independent? How do we support employment that enables people to keep themselves and their families out of poverty? How do we provide housing that's affordable, safe and sustainable in places which are clean and green? How do we support people to feel safe in their own home and when they're accessing their community? Connecting people with their families and friends, the chance for a fresh start when things go wrong, access to health and social care when people need it. And finally, that kind of pivotal thing around people being accepted and valued in their communities simply for who they are. So in that context, we're putting forward a real aspiration that in the way we work with our neighbourhoods, we have a really clear drive to ensure every child, young person and adult has that opportunity to live their best life. Next slide, please. Through the workshop sessions, we've started to develop our thinking and our understanding around what do neighbourhoods mean to us and how will we start to work in a different way. We've identified that we will have 2 localities in West Northants. Locality number 1 will be South Northants and Daventry, which will have more of a rural flavour to it. There are areas of urban nature in there. But generally, it does give us that ability to focus on some of the factors that affect people from a rural perspective. Locality number 2 will be around Northampton. So in population terms, that gives us around about 180,000 in South Northampton Dav, and it gives us around 220,000 for Northampton, roughly. What we've then set out is based on NHS England guidance that we would look to divide our localities based on probably clusters of wards into neighbourhoods that have got an average 45,000 population. Now, given the geographical size of particularly some of our areas in South Northampton and Daventry, we might have some big neighbourhoods which actually have a lower level of population, whereas in Northampton, we are likely to see higher. So they will range between 30 and 50,000. The whole notion of this is that these neighbourhoods in their design are small enough to care, but are also big enough to enable us to have an economy of scale for this to be financially sustainable. Each neighbourhood will be unique, and the approaches we take forward will need to focus on both the strengths and assets alongside the deficits in each of those neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. We've then started to talk a bit around, well, what do those neighbourhoods look like and how do we drive change? And the first thing that we kind of identified is that in each of our neighbourhoods, we need to have a local data and insight plan, which describes the strengths and assets of that local area alongside its challenges, and that we map those local area profiles against those 10 live your best life demands. That'll, in a sense, give us an understanding of those things which are working well or not so well in each of our neighbourhoods. There's a link on the screen to an approach that's been taken forward in Brighton and Hove through a local insight model. In effect, what Brighton and Hove have done is they've pulled together into a single place a whole host of publicly available data that goes from numbers of people who are in receipt of state benefits, people who are in fuel poverty. They've mapped their housing developments, their GP surgeries, their libraries. What they've also been able to do by automating a lot of this is on a monthly basis, produce updated local area profiles. And if you have an opportunity to have a look at these are local area profiles that are far beyond what we've traditionally done from a joint strategic needs perspective. These really are understanding the nuts and bolts of how our communities are constructed, so that when we start to bring together our resources alongside those of our colleagues, our partners, and our local people, we can really start to identify priorities from an evidence base that we will know will make the biggest difference in people's lives. Having produced those kind of local area profiles, the next bit is about how we have a local neighbourhood partnership. And we would envisage that that local neighbourhood partnership might operate not dissimilar to a school governor type model. And sitting within that neighbourhood partnership would be an opportunity for elected members, statutory organisations, GPs, local residents, local voluntary sector organisations, and potentially in the future, local business. Local business is a real example of a way in which we need to work differently. If we recognise that poverty, for example, is inextricably linked to poorer and low paid employment, the more we can work from an economic perspective to improve the scale and wealth of local business, the more we see better opportunities for local business. So we've got to start to bring those conversations together in a much more rounded way. What we've then kind of defined is that local area, that local neighbourhood partnership would work to put in place a plan for the neighbourhood based on that evidence base. And we'd envisage within that plan that there would be a number of different mechanisms around how that plan might be delivered. So they include things that we might do from a People's Charter perspective. People might have an awareness of something called the Wigan Deal. So in Wigan, what they did, for example, is they said, we will make swimming free for under 12s. The deal is you bring your kids so that they learn to swim. The deal might be that through public health, we'll put on support and training to enable people to cook healthier food. The deal is that you come along and then actually have been on that course, you follow through and you start to do some of the things that you've been supported to do. So there's a level of kind of citizen empowerment in and amongst this. The next bit is around how we might devolve money to particular neighbourhoods in order to take forward specific interventions. So in kind of conversation with Sally, there's a real opportunity for us in many ways to hit 3 birds with 1 stone with this. When you look at those domains of a good life that we've defined, and then you think about health inequalities, equally from a West Northampton perspective, you're going to have a bit of an update later on the agenda around our anti-poverty strategy. They are all the same things. So a level of targeted investment in this approach has a real opportunity to make a significant difference for us. The next kind of opportunity to work differently is around how we can improve integration and collaboration within our teams, and Katie will talk to you in a minute about what that might look like. We also recognise that there will be issues within our neighbourhoods that are too big to be dealt with at a neighbourhood level, and as such there will need to be services and intervention which operate at a place level. Equally, there are likely to be issues which are too big to be managed or influenced at a place level, which will require a system intervention. And if you take Toby's comments from earlier, equally, there might be even bigger things and more complex things that allow us to work on a regional footprint to address local need. I'm going to hand over to Katie now, who's going to kind of give you some examples of those things that I've mentioned, and talk to you a little bit around our thoughts on integrated team structures and some support that we've got to take this forward. Katie.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Cheryl. These are just some illustrative examples of what each of those boxes on the previous slide look like. So, for example, in relation to the People's Charter, you may well have seen that West Northants has started something called the Big Conversation with their citizens, our population more generically as a new organisation, about the types of things and interactions that they might want from their council and how we can engage differently with them as a new organisation. And obviously I've had those conversations with Dion, so we're clear that that incorporates some of the conversations we might want to have around the ICS more broadly, and equally that that fits in with the direction of travel around engagement more specifically in the strategy that will be in place moving forward. In terms of devolved monies, so examples there are things that we're all familiar with, so that will be the public health grant, the integrated care board via the partnership, and the local authority, and that's potentially how we may in the future devolve money more locally, and how those commissioning decisions and how we think differently around place may develop over time. 5 is on the next slide, because that's the one I think everyone's interested in, which what neighbourhood partnerships and teams might look like. An example of a place-wide response obviously is something like the Specialist Full Service, which works across 2 of the key, well, are 2 places. And the last one is around a system-wide response. So, for example, a good example would be our acute mental health beds. Next slide, please, Cheryl. I don't know whether we can move the Zoom box. So this is just some of the thoughts, and it's got thoughts and suggestions at the top, because this is broadly what, in its broadest term, we believe neighbourhood integrated teams could look like. And obviously you've got primary care networks, including some of the stuff that's currently happening in the collaboratives as part of ICANN, which is the MDT welfare teams. You've got the function of adult social care and our front door community teams. All of NHFT's services are across community nursing, the therapy elements that we both do, the community and voluntary sector, in terms of the vast opportunity that gives us, particularly at neighbourhood level, ageing well, supporting independence and social prescribing, all of which sit in and around the ICANN collaborative, but equally add real richness and value to what can happen at neighbourhood level. Children and young people services, which is also a collaborative, and you'll see a theme here about that real alignment that needs to take place between the collaborative and their development, and how we align that with place. And then on the other side, obviously housing teams, so things that sit very much in local government, welfare, benefits and debt teams, supporting people that obviously with very specific challenges that have at specific times in their lives. Learning disability and autism, and how that will work across place. We know at the moment that in terms of particularly as a collaborative, they're in the formative steps of really starting to work in an integrated way. The mental health collaborative, which is obviously far more advanced in its development. Neighbourhood policing, community safety, and I put spaces, and in that I mean all the spaces that we have between us, particularly at local government, and not forgetting the town and parish councils, who have a vast amount of things like allotments and parks, and also social and leisure. Sport and leisure. That isn't an exhaustive list, but when you take the breadth of local government and what we can do as statutory partners at a neighbourhood and place level, the opportunity to work very differently together. And certainly when we think about the opportunities that there are, for example, in our sport and leisure facilities that we access some of, but don't fully access to the full potential to certainly meet those wider determinants of health and some of our inequalities challenges. And we will come back to this in a minute, I believe, as part of the debate and discussion. Next slide, please, Cheryl. You may well be aware that we have had, no, sorry, the one back, not the story, that one, thank you. This is very wordy, but PA, which is an organisation which has been supporting both with the national programme, but has also supported us locally with our ICS development. We are in the process of defining the next steps of support that we need from them in relation to place. And that is very much around the nuts and bolts and the structure. So making sure that as we move between now and July and go into some shadow forms for some things and develop some things, which you'll see on the map we've done at the end of what we think that will look like between now and July, It's making sure that we have the formal elements, the things that don't excite us so much, but actually make the world tick in place. So that's really about terms of reference, governance, have we got the interactions right? And where we are working with the NHSE Place Development Programme, being clear at where that takes us to as a place development programme and what we will need to do in addition to that to make us good to go in July. Happy to take any questions about those elements, but that really is, I think, one of the biggest things we've asked them for support with as well is what infrastructure do we need to manage this to be effective, because 9 neighbourhood partnerships, for example, just won't function without any support. So what kind of support and how would we work with those neighbourhood partnerships to develop an infrastructure that almost as we go on makes them self-sustaining in that governance structure in terms of how they can operate at a local level.
Next slide, and then we'll open this up for discussion if that's okay. So the next slide is just a really simple depiction of how we envisage this can start to work. So on the left-hand side, in effect, what we're depicting is our 9 neighbourhoods sitting under our 2 locality forums, reporting into our Health and Wellbeing Board. Our Health and Wellbeing Board then reports into, influences and feeds back from the Integrated Care Partnership. On the right-hand side are some suggested mechanics of how we start to build some of this stuff. So the groups that we've got at the bottom, to some extent, might be time limited in nature and are about providing a level of opportunity to bring things together. So the language is a bit small, so I'll kind of go through them. So the first one we've got on there is something about bringing together, and we've chose this language specifically so that it doesn't mean that colleagues outside of care are being dragged into a health and social care environment. We started to use this language of communities of practice. So the first one we're putting forward is we want to establish a local data and insight community of practice, which would allow us to bring together business intelligence and analysts from police, from fire, from community safety, from our housing associations, to be combined in then with the richness of data that we see through our JSNA, through our census data, through our health and social care data, with the absolute priority being on getting them all to orientate around the same geography. And if we can get them to orientate around those 10 live your best life domains, we end up in a position then where we have that really rich depiction of where we are from a data perspective. That as a community of practice, he's put something of value that might continue in perpetuity to ensure that we've always have that ability to act on the most relevant data. There's another one in there around a community of practice around co-production and engagement. Within our respective organisations, we all have a vast amount of communication and engagement programmes alongside co-production that we do throughout the year. What we're not very good at is coordinating that. An example I keep using is from a West Northants perspective, we have 3 big housing providers in Grand Union, Futures and MPH. Each of those 3 housing providers does a survey of 25% of their residents on an annual basis. For MPH, that's 11,000 units of accommodation that they do a survey on every year. We've never before had an opportunity to influence that in a sense of how we might want to work based on local neighbourhood priorities, or to make the best of some of that data. The other groups that we've got in here are around how do we establish something for place commissioning? So how do we have that opportunity to bring together budgets and align contracts in and around some of this stuff? And then you've got some groups which are more structurally defined. So how do we get to a point where we can build our partnerships and build our teams? And equally, how can we look at neighbourhoods and assets? The kind of reddish boxes that are sit above, in effect, is about how do we ensure that when we look at the collaboratives, that there is a consistent approach to how they will be delivered at place. People will have heard me say this a number of times, but I'm a bit hubbed out in every single kind of collaborative and transformation meeting that we attend, the language of hubs is used. But those hubs tend to have a different definition every time they're described. And we probably don't have enough public buildings to accommodate the amount of hubs that we hear about. So this is a real opportunity for us to start to bring that together to make sure that we don't have duplication, particularly when we start to go out to the public. If we're using language of hubs, and it's hubs used plurally, we'll end up with people coming to the wrong services, which will mean that we're on a losing battle to kind of start off with. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to kind of throw this out for discussion. So Matt, do you want to kind of cover off the discussion points?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Katie. So I'm very clear in my mind where I am with this approach, but very interested to hear comments from colleagues around the table. So if you want to open it up, if anybody wants to volunteer, or shall I volunteer, Toby? Yeah, what a.
You say if you rely on me to start off at some point. I mean, the first thing to say is I really welcome this. I think it's good work. I think the West is leading the way in this space at the moment in terms of kind of starting to sketch this out. And I think you can see the consideredness and the thought and the detail that sits behind it. So really, really welcome it. I think the element of consistency that we're starting to see across East and West, so North and West, is helpful on this because it just gives those of us who work on a county-wide footprint something to work with. And I think the language, if nothing else, of starting to move to some consistency on that as well, and common view is really, really helpful. A few practical thoughts. There's some things in all of this that are going to make sense for us to do, particularly I think some of the intelligence, the analytics, the insights piece, where through public health teams, my resource in terms of NHS kind of capability together with police and other agencies, some of those things probably going to make sense to do collectively. I think there's some interesting opportunities there. We need to work through, I really like the delivery group kind of model in this idea, and having those two delivery groups for each of our two places. From my perspective, we need to look from a health point of view at how we align some of our resource, particularly commission resource, into some of that. And I think the opportunities that Katie was talking about around joint commissioning, for example, for me extends to things like voluntary sector funding and contracts. You know, we often talk, many of us in this room, about the fact that lots of us fund particular services or particular organisations to do certain things. I'd be really interested to say, what does that look like if we start to get that out on a map and start to look at that geographically and how it relates to those areas. So I think there's real opportunities there. I also think there's a link, Colin, into where we're heading with general practice and primary care networks and the future of current CCG locality arrangements, where we're asking the LMC at the moment to take a role working with general practice about taking on some of that kind of function. And I think that potentially docks quite nicely into the kind of locality or the forum approach that we're developing here. So we start to have a number of things that nestle together. So I really welcome this. I think it's really, really good work. I think there's a great blueprint there for us to start moving forwards with. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Toby. Anybody else? Bob? Well, you go first. I've got to transfer the microphone anyway.
Just got, I think, questions rather than, I think it's really good. I think this is really the framework for excellent way forward. I think it's real potential here. I've got some questions about when we're participating with local communities, the most articulate communities will argue for better services. How do we mitigate, and we'll get them, you know, this is what's happening. How do we make sure we're not reinforcing what we're already doing at the moment? Because COVID has accentuated health inequalities, and we've got to really work to push that back. So that's one question I've got. I've got a question about working with the voluntary sector. I've worked across both. I think the statutory sector is remarkably bad at working properly with the voluntary sector, and I think we have to really work at that. I don't think we understand how badly the average practitioner in the statutory sector kind of has not got the voluntary sector as part of their kind of worldview. Then I think there's something about, Yeah, we had a workshop day on Saturday for local authority councillors, and the issue of technology and how do we make sure our technology investment is going along with this, because they're busily within the local authority at least producing, you know, the next generation of our kind of what we need for technical support, and how do we make sure we build that into all of this? And that's probably quite enough.
Thank you, Bob.
To start with.
Do you want to pick those up, Stuart?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing that I would say is that this is evolving, and part of this journey is about how we engage and bring as many people along with us on the ride, so that as we start to formulate some of the detail around this, we kind of use the expertise across our patch to really structure stuff that works. I think it's a really valid point around how do we ensure that the loudest, most articulate voices don't get access to the biggest resources. And I think we probably encounter that sometimes on a day-to-day basis in some of the services we deliver. I think what I would kind of identify is I'm really keen that a whole host of this is orientated around those local area profiles. That notion of moving as much as we can in decision making to be orientated around an evidence base means that it's not necessarily about how loud or articulate an individual it is. It's about the data and what that's telling us. And I think we could put our hands up to say, if we look at across some of our investment at the moment, does it absolutely match with what you might see if we did some of those local area profiles? I'd say probably not. The voluntary sector have been on this journey with us so far. So I think I'm on my third kind of workshop session with them. We have a further session, I think, on week beginning the 21st of March. Russell's not here today, but I think Russell has managed to get some funding, a decent amount of funding, to support the voluntary sector in its kind of transition to this kind of new way of working. And I suppose your final point on technology is I think it's something that in effect would benefit from one of those communities of practice, because increasingly we're reliant upon an expectation that everybody has an equality of access to technology, and we know in some of our most deprived areas that's not the case. But this is very much so going to be an opportunity to kind of work and shape as we go, but it's good.
Sally?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of points. So just going back to the conversation we had earlier about the pandemic and COVID, I mean, if there were any positives, one of the positives that came out was that sort of sense of community connectedness, those partnerships, those relationships that were built, and the response, including huge from the voluntary sector as well. And I think working in this way gives us a chance to really sort of capitalise on all those relationships and really get those people involved in improving health and wellbeing at a community level. So that's the first point. And then Councillor Pearson mentioned sort of health inequalities, and I think Chloe's going to talk on this in a second, but the challenge for each of these groups at each of the different geographies is going to be about understanding what the health inequalities in those areas are and coming together to actually, you know, try and do something about them. So just a couple of points I wanted to make.
Thank you, Sally. Fiona?
Fairly basic question, really. If we all work together and this goes well, it will be an amazing programme for our residents. When do you think you'll be ready with a clear, easily understandable programme to actually put out to our residents so they do understand what it is that they're going to be moving into?
If I could just pause in answering that, because we've put together a bit of an outline roadmap at the end of the slide set so that we can kind of take people through our thoughts. Thank you.
Colin?
I was just wondering, just from a mechanical perspective, you're using PCNs as one of the units going forwards. Has anybody actually done any mapping to see if they tie up with your council wards?
Yes, they don't. So I think what there is a real challenge in us defining the geography, because we need to gain consensus on something that there won't be consensus, if that makes sense. If you just look at ward clusters, Katie started to produce languages of a straw man just to start the debate on this. And we're doing some engagement with our political colleagues next week, and we want to do the same session with our GP colleagues, because there are wards that have significant levels of deprivation that sit right next to areas of real affluence. And the value in this is about how do we achieve as much commonality in geography as possible, but we're not going to get absolute commonality. So I think if we start from a premise that there isn't going to be a perfect solution, this is about how do we get something that works best for everybody, then that's most likely to be the mechanism by which we'll get consensus.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Toby first.
Yeah, and I think Naomi was waving just very
Yeah,
subtly
I've
as
got
well,
Naomi.
yeah.
I've got Naomi.
Just a very quick comment, just coming back in again. And it links to the next item on health and wellbeing. I think if we're serious about this agenda, that really poses a challenge to us about this forum, because I think this becomes the place board that sits into that set of the kind of structure that you were describing. And I'll say this as someone who sat around health and wellbeing boards in lots of places over many years of iterations of them. I think, if I'm frank, I've always struggled, and we've always struggled, whatever health and wellbeing forum I've been in, to be really clear what the purpose, the added value was of that forum. At times they felt almost quasi-health scrutiny meetings, at times they're not necessarily here, but in other patches I've been, etc. And I think this gives a really, really very clear purpose in terms of driving that agenda. But the interesting thing for me, particularly around the role of this forum, is that's a much broader agenda than health and care. Rightly so, and that's important. But if it is, I think it poses a challenge to how do we look at the membership of this kind of forum, in playing that kind of function if we wanted to be able to do so. I think it's the right thing to do, but I think we should recognise that it means this needs to evolve in terms of what we're doing to be able to steer that effectively.
And that's a conversation we'll have in a minute. Yeah, Naomi.
And I think that there's what is to choose the fellowship. And it's really complicated, it's really important. One of the outcomes that was in the draft outcomes was reduction in self-harm. Obviously, it's a good idea to self-harm. If the next year, not a single 15-year-old of themselves, and not 60 doesn't come out. Luckily, it's not enough, and that's very good news. So it's not that it's not an issue we have to address. It's that your outcomes, and then looking at the population, you have to not percentages of the increase. You have to look at how so something like smoking pregnancy actually does push it that much. But reduction in self-harm. So it's another test that's quite difficult and quite difficult on the ground. So I'm not being difficult of this. Secondly, again, in a little bit and particularly
Thinking about secondary school catchments, because that might, map onto whatever the 35, 40, whatever. But it is, I think academisation organisation has, one of the things it's really damaged, maybe it's good for some things, but it has really lost the really vital link for local government in terms of the way we relate to the whole child population. And anything you can do in this piece to have much stronger relationships with particularly secondary schools, but obviously primary schools as well, I think is really, really important. And the last thing I want to say is think very clearly about what the public wants to know. I mean, personally, I don't want to know about the plumbing. I don't need to know about how my electric car works. I need to know where to plug it in. You know, so the public, my experience is the public wants to know, how will it feel? They want to be treated with dignity and respect. They want things that, there's all things that they want that's about, will it be on time? Will it stop hurting? And will I get better? Or will my house work? Or will I get, you know, it's much more about the how and the what than the underpinning structures, which for me is boring. So for anybody, you know, don't overcomplicate it in terms of communication with the public. What we want to know from the public is, what are you dissatisfied with now? And to be quite honest about whether it's fixable or not, because sometimes it isn't. You know, so it's those sorts of thoughtful things about who you're communicating with, not just, how do we explain this all? It's so complicated. Don't bother. You know, I mean, I wouldn't.
Thank you, Naomi. David.
Thanks. So I really welcome this. I think it presents a kind of a unique opportunity to rebalance power between organisations and citizens. It presents a really powerful framework for that. And I'd agree with Councillor Purser that relationship with the social capital that's locked into the voluntary sector and their capabilities is immense. And probably we're only touching the surface of it in terms of some of the work we're doing. I guess just in terms of programme of change, really, which is back to Councillor Baker's point, there's a lot happening currently. There's integrated care systems, boards, collaboratives, new statutory entities, place, and our colleagues, our teams on the ground, our residents, and they will be some of our champions for this if we get the messaging right, because they'll be the ones who are able to convey why this matters and why it's going to make a difference. So I guess there's we just need to be mindful of pace of change. So what's possible now in this year in terms of the programme overall, and then be clear about how we're using our teams, staff, to actually be the conveyors of some of this methodology and this way of thinking, because they'll be some of the biggest advocates if we do get it right. So just those kind of two things just to counterbalance the enthusiasm.
Thank you, David. Joe.
Thank you. I absolutely welcome this. I think it is much more digestible than many of the papers that a lot of us read in other settings. So I think it will actually mean something to the public that we serve. So I think I'm very positive about this. There will be those who are cynical, and we will always have to deal with them. But I think I'm very positive about this as an approach. I think the point that David made about community champions, or whatever we want to call them, and we may need to decide what we call them, those people who are embedded, is particularly important with regard to communities who are relatively isolated from our reach and from our communication. And we've seen this particularly with regard to vaccination uptakes, where people are getting their information from. I'm thinking particularly of the Eastern European community that I serve. Somehow, however much information we've given, it has not been incorporated into action in the same way as it has in somebody else living in exactly the same neighbourhood with exactly the same, in theory, opportunities. It has not been understood in the same way. So I think that's really important. We look at community champions. And then just the final point, which I know people often mention, is about the challenge between wants and needs. So our data will tell us what a community might need. We'll obviously engage and find out some of those wants. And I think there's always going to be a challenge between matching the wants and needs. And it may be that we need to compromise in granting some of the wants, even if they're not necessarily the needs, in order to bring our, or rather, we may wish to, not my decision to make, but we may wish to consider granting some wants so that we get the needs that we need for the population. Other people may feel differently about it, but I'm going to pop that one in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I'll just give my penny's worth, if I may. I'm wholeheartedly behind this approach. The context I've always brought to health and wellbeing boards in the past, and I think of some of the development sessions we've had, is, well, what does this mean to the people that I represent. You know, we talk about big strategic plans. How does that reach down to our communities? And I think for the first time, or for one of the only times, I think I can see a clear sort of thread all the way up to the big strategic you know, priorities and things that we're trying to achieve, and then all the way back down again into those communities that will hopefully enable them to, on evidence, as we've talked about, and the right data to make decisions for those localities. And there's the infrastructure around it to, you know, plug into regional things like Toby's talked about, or system things. So I think it's something that if we can sit here in 2 or 3 years that we've got anywhere near achieving what we've talked about, we can be really, really proud of. So I think there's a lot to get behind here, and I'm really, really keen, is my view. Stuart. What's the next?
And in the context of that membership, I think we need to recognise that if we are to really drive those domains of live your best life, we probably need some additional people joining both our board and our forums. Now, for me, having had a think about this and having reflections from some colleagues in the room, the easiest bit would be to kind of suggest that we ensure that there is a level of representation of individuals of influence across each of those 10 domains, which then would mean that we can have an opportunity to have an individual to hold to account, so to speak, in relation to each one of those domains. There are some other elements to this which I haven't got clever answers to, so I'd kind of like to propose that as the first one in relation to that being the main structure of our membership. The next one is there's been lots of mention around engagement and co-production with local people. We don't necessarily have a group of local people who are actively engaged with the board. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying that we invite 25 people from different wards to come and join the board, but we do need to have some ability on a regular basis to sense check where we're up to and to validate our thinking in and around some of these things. So I'd welcome kind of people's views in the first instance around that kind of membership discussion. And I'd envisage that membership would be replicated across both the board and the forums in order for them to be as inclusive as they need. And then equally that kind of discussion about how do we ensure that co-production is central to what we do and not just an add-on once the point that we've come up with some clever idea. People's views?
Any comments? Views? So, Toby.
I wasn't meaning to preempt where you were about to go next on the last comment that I made, but it just struck me as such an obvious point that if we're going to get behind that agenda, we've got to think about membership. So whether that's 10 people covering those things, or whether the principle of we need to have somebody around the table who's able to engage or hear when we need to have them here on those things that relate to those agendas, whether it's directly holding them to account for something or whether it's them connecting back into a network of other organisations that work in that space. I haven't really got a view on, but I'm sure if you started to map it through, you'd come to a view about which players need to be around the table all of the time and who might be here some of the time to help us do those things. So I think that principle of coverage across the spectrum of things that we're trying to hold here through a place board is absolutely right. On the just a thought on the kind of wider public, citizen, patient, however we choose to describe service user kind of engagement. I know that Dion, from a system point of view, is also doing work and giving thought to how do we try and connect together, because actually we've got masses of different routes and networks and forums. On Monday night this week, I did a session with the NHFT and one of the acute trusts with their governors membership, and they've got members of people there who are coming. So we've got lots of almost networks of networks that feels to me if we could find some way to connect some of those around our two places, that might almost give us, wrong language, but citizen assembly type forums that we could connect with on a whole range of different things and potentially resource and support in a joint way between us, rather than the health, for example, going off and creating integrated care board engagement forums at the same time. And we've got things like PPG groups within practices. I know we've got all of us around the table will no doubt have those kind of things that are there. So I think it'd be quite interesting to pick that up and see how could we build on some of those things. But I think the primacy of place in doing that in those two kind of footprints and then coming together would be good.
Thank you, Toby. David, did you have a comment? Please come up.
I'm Clinical Director of GPA Alliance, which I've admitted, and I'm a chair of our Health and Wellbeing Forum for Northampton. So great, I welcome the report looks good because Northampton as a locality, often the localities get forgotten. Northampton's the average town, so your locality work is great. I think the points, I think of communities, I was at a meeting last night, a big meeting with Broadmead Baptist Church as a community in Headlands, and they wanted to reach out and say, what can we do? So they've got a big community of both all political parties are engaged in this, and they're asking, what do they want? And you're right, what they wanted was car parks, not to park around the corners. And that was one of the key things that was a big issue, and the issue of people inappropriate behavior. So those are their issues. I think the opportunities of how we can have forums with people is key and absolutely key. The other question really to health is where are we going with personal health budgets? Because absolutely, if, we were a champion 10 years ago, and I led that with Julie Curtis, and the opportunity to move into personalisation and thinking what matters to me. And then we've got a big personalisation agenda going through health. That's a big opportunity. What matters to me, not what matters to you. The second point is we've got a big opportunity around the Prevention Concordat, which is looking at the underpinning determinants and really looks at the UNSPG, which the government has signed up to, but don't always do, the UNSPG goals, and how do we put those into place? And so if you have the Prevention Concordat and personalisation sitting alongside population health, you have a very neat triangle to bring this together. My last point would be you have all the data, which is quantitative, it's numbers. Where's the qualitative data? Where's your research, which is actually saying the evidence base, what is the qualitative data, what are the stories? You've got this through social prescribing, you've got case studies, you've got people out there, but we don't collect it. We just collect numbers. And I think health is beyond numbers. It's about people and relationships, and that's what matters. But I'm great, I was part of the Health and Wellbeing Forum when it started, and I now see that you're dealing more from health, moving to wellbeing and addressing the underpinning needs, and that I welcome, because as I've left general practice, the health service only addressed 20% of health outcomes. It's 40% of people's actions. And until we actually directly engage the public and directly engage them in their own healthcare, in their own actions, then I think we're failing.
Thank you, David. Is there anything you wanted to pick up on there? Yeah. Okay, so as far as the future of the Health and Wellbeing Board states, there's something that we need to go.
Probably suggest as the kind of first piece is to map kind of membership of the board against those domains, and we could circulate that around the board for the discussion, and then we'll take that from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we happy with that approach? Good. And just thank everybody for the conversation we've just had about the ICP and that work. So thank you. So we'll move on to the Health Equalities Plan, if that's okay. And we've got Chloe. Hello, Chloe.
Hi. There's some slides. I don't know if they're in your packs or if I can put them up, but oh yeah, that's it. So just a quick update on the Health Inequalities Plan that the excuse me, frog in my throat. NHS England have required us as a system, as the ICS, to write a Health Inequalities Plan, which has to be submitted in draft form at the end of March. So I've just come to share with you the progress on the development of that plan. If you just flick to the next slide. Oh, sorry, yeah, that was it. So in terms of kind of the requirements of the plan from NHS England, was a request that the Director of Public Health coordinate it, but it was very clear that it was a system-wide plan and it needs to articulate how we're going to work together across local authority, NHS and voluntary and community sector. So it's really kind of setting out that vision for how we're going to work together to address health inequalities. The ICS boards need to sign off that plan, and it needs to align with kind of all of our existing work of the health and wellbeing boards, our joint health and wellbeing strategies and JSNA documents. So the plan is submitted in draft form at the end of March, but then we've got the whole of April to June to get it signed off and go through all of that board approval process. So we'll be bringing it back to you in June as a kind of final document for you to approve. Come to the next slide. So in terms of the outline of the plan and what it's going to look like, it's just going to start with kind of a general introduction to health inequalities, setting out the national and local context. There's a new framework for addressing health inequalities that's been produced by a national health inequalities team in NHS England called the Core 20+5 framework. And that sets out an approach to addressing health inequalities, focusing on the 20% most deprived populations, plus any local priority populations. And then there's 5 areas that we need to tackle, which are maternity, cancer, respiratory, cardiovascular disease, and mental health, particularly focusing on physical health checks for mental health. We're producing a data pack which reflects where we are at the moment in terms of inequalities. And then the plan will set out a set of broad guiding principles of actions that we all need to take across the system. And so these absolutely will include how everybody needs to understand what health inequalities are and their role in it, from kind of strategic decision-making level right to frontline staff, and how we're going to support staff to do that. It includes collection of data and understanding needs, including that qualitative insight and working with communities to understand their needs, as well as that really community-driven, community-led approach, embedding co-production in everything that we do. And then making sure we're kind of taking quality, building health inequalities into our quality improvement processes. And then alongside those guiding principles, which everybody across the system will agree to, there's our priority areas. So absolutely referencing the Core 20+5. If you flick to the next slide. So NHS England, again, have outlined they want us to cover each of these areas for action in the plan, specifically talking about how we're going to work together as a system to address the wider determinants of health, including making reference of our roles as anchor institutions and our environmental impact. How we're going to improve health and well-being through our prevention, thinking about physical and mental health, vaccination and screening, and then moving on to healthcare services, social care, and then end-of-life support. So the plan will be really quite high-level strategic aims around each of these areas, kind of setting out our commitments and our vision. But then alongside that, we've obviously got our place-based plans that are being developed. So this is going to be quite a high-level strategic commitments that we will all agree to as a system, but then recognising that there are very kind of detailed place-based plans with associated actions that are being developed as our kind of new ICS is being developed. And then also it will include how we're going to monitor progress. And really key to this is our link to the outcomes framework that's been developed, and again, the priorities that they've identified and how we're going to monitor those. And then finally, looking at the governance structures. And again, that will kind of mirror the ICS governance structures that are being developed, and making sure that health inequalities is embedded in that. So at the moment, so health inequalities sits under the Population Health Board at the moment. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you kind of timelines of this. So a lot of this work is already happening in terms of the work of the collaboratives. It's embedded in what the collaboratives are doing and already work across all of our partners. So I've been working with a range of partners and leads in different service areas to kind of gather what actions they're taking and what they will commit to around health inequalities. And I'm going to be pulling that together to have a first draft imminently that we can then start to share to get feedback on. There's a Health and Wellbeing Board development session arranged for the 16th of March, where we can have discussions about what's in the plan, about those principles that have been proposed, and get some feedback on if they're practical and what are the barriers and enablers to embedding those principles in our organisations, as well as looking at some of those priorities and the next steps. So as soon as we've got a draft ready, I will share with you as the Health and Wellbeing Board and ask that you kind of share with your relevant people to get your feedback, and then also come along to the development session to have that discussion. Following on from the development session, I'll collate all of that feedback and engagement to produce a report, final report to send to NHS England, and then we'll go through the approvals process. Any questions?
Excellent, thank you, Chloe. And I just wanted to mention that one of my colleagues is now acting as our health inequalities champion, one of my member colleagues within the council, and has been working with Chloe and Sally on how we can make sure that's embedded in everything we do and all the decisions we take. Was there any comments or points? Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Hi, thank you, Chloe. And can I just say, Chloe, that Chloe's working really hard on this at the moment, and the timescales are absolutely ridiculous, aren't they? So just wanted to thank her for that. But I just wanted to say, I think the challenge for us, just going back to that previous discussion we were having about neighbourhoods and place, the challenge for us is making sure that this very high level strategic document absolutely links through into those priorities. And the times are slightly out of sync at the moment, but because the plan is high level, it gives us an opportunity as we go forward to sort of build on it further, doesn't it, really? Thank you.
Thank you. Toby.
Yeah, thank you. Chloe, this is clearly hugely important, isn't it? Massively important piece of work. And just building on what Sally was saying, I'll be a bit blunter. The NHSE ask on this is a bit bonkers in the wrong way around in terms of the timing on it all. So asking ICE Systems to produce an inequalities plan by the end of March, at the same time as producing, we were talking earlier on about the Integrated Care Partnership, producing an overarching strategy and outcomes framework, which we need to do by, I think it's the back end of the summer, September, something of that order. And just looking at the timeline you put on the screen, which talks about producing a draft to submit to NHS England by the end of March, and then a final version at the end of June, presumably the expectation being there ain't much change between the two of them, is just all wrong at a local level, isn't it? And I think what we need to do is find a way to be able to respond to the ask yes and no to that. But the reason we're doing this is for us, not for NHS England. I know it doesn't always feel that way around when you've got regulators asking for things, but I personally think we need to find a way to frame this in the context of an iterative thing, that as we carry on the work that we've just been talking about around place and around our neighbourhoods, and as the ICP and the ICB start to find their feet, and we've got new members coming in, this ought to be this is going to be meaningful. It needs to be a big developmental piece that we have a proper conversation about throughout the whole of that period. And we have to find a way, and people like I can help in this, to manage the NHSE end of it that says, we'll share some stuff with you. It's a work in progress, but what you see in March is not going to be the same as what you see in June. And what you see in June probably isn't and shouldn't be a final version. It's something actually, because we've got a process here about producing an overarching outcomes framework and a strategy that sits with it. So I say all of that from the spirit of, this is so important. We need to not treat it as an exercise to answer a question to NHSE, but something that works for us. And if some of us then have to help you and others to manage the kind of relationship bit with NHSE on that, and that's what we ought to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Toby. Is there anything you wanted to pick up, Chloe?
No, but yeah, that's really great. And I think absolutely the place-based bits is where the detail comes in. And I think that's what I'm trying to make the plans, but it's quite high level. So they're ambitions, but it's the detail that we can take longer about and have that proper engagement and co-produce some of those actions with communities and build in those priorities as we develop our kind of neighbourhood and our places. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I've got on my note here to remind everybody that there is a development workshop on the 16th of March at 1 o'clock, if we can encourage some colleagues from our organisations to go and support that, and email Cheryl if they can. So we'll just ask board to note that work and thank Chloe, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move on. I'm conscious it's nearly 3 o'clock. We've got till 3:30, I think, haven't we? But the next item is an update on our anti-poverty strategy that Stuart's already alluded to. And as a new council and administration, we made it a clear priority of ours that we put an anti-poverty strategy in place, and it's fallen within my portfolio. So I've been working with Stuart and colleagues, and Vicky's was on the call, I did notice earlier, who's been working hard on this. Obviously, we know of some of the inequalities we've spoken about, and also we know about the geography of the rurality and some of the issues that presents, and the urban nature of and some of the deprivation, especially in Northampton, and there's a couple of places in Daventry as well. So we made it a real priority as a new council to try and get to grips with some of this and make some changes that are within our power. But it also sits really well with some of the work that Stuart's already talked about today. So it feels like it's all sort of coming together quite well. And we've had a look, I'm sure I'm not stealing Stuart's thunder, but we've had a look up and down the country. We identified Salford as somewhere that has put together a really good strategy. So we contacted them and basically asked if we could pinch most of their good ideas, basically, and they've been really helpful. So we're excited about this. I know colleagues in the room have helped with this. We set up a group, and we're hopefully bringing it to Cabinet and Council quite soon. That's my update. Stuart.
I think you've provided a pretty decent update on that, Matt. I think the first thing, the only other thing to say is that the anti-poverty strategy is the first strategy that we've woven in the live your best life to it, as we really identify it as being something which really will contribute to our integrated care partnership in place. So as Matt alluded to, it will be going through Cabinet shortly, and we'll bring it through Health and Wellbeing Board so that you can see that connectivity. It is likely to be something that is held as a priority in perpetuity, in the sense that we're not going to make inroads on poverty overnight. Matt mentioned around the Salford approach. Central to Salford's approach is this notion of the strategy being held to account. And it's held to account in the sense that an annual report is provided both to the Health and Wellbeing Board and to the Council on an annual basis to depict the improvements or not, in some cases, that are being made. And in order for the Health and Wellbeing Board and Council to inform the next year's kind of priorities, and we'd envisage that our local anti-poverty strategy will be structured in the same way.
And just to add, we've sort of gone out of our way, not just to make it a council piece of work where this is what we think we should do. We've been really open and working with our voluntary sector partners to make sure we've got a good sort of collaborative approach to trying to meet the need and identify what we need to do. But I'm sure we'll bring it to the Health and Wellbeing Board when it's fully baked. Thank you. Is there any comments or queries, Naomi?
Yeah, please don't wait till it's fully baked.
Well, yeah.
Please.
But that was the point, and what Salford said as well. They said, just get on with it, do it.
Yeah.
And don't worry about how it looks to present from a corporate point of view. Yeah. So yeah.
And just say, I mean, I'm sure that you know this, but the most important thing in an anti-poverty strategy is figuring out how to get people more money or make things cost less. Everything else ameliorates the impact of poverty, but poverty means not having enough money. So it just really, and voluntary sector is great at ameliorating the impact of poverty, but putting more money in people's pockets is how you reduce poverty.
Thank you. Toby?
I should probably know the answer to this, but is the work you're doing around anti-poverty linking, we Naomi talked earlier on about the 4 aims, the 4 purposes of integrated care systems, and the 4th one of those was around anchor institution. And one of the ways to get more money into people's pockets is to actually get them in, support them into employment, and employment that pays a reasonable wage. And the anchor institution bit, I don't like the phraseology, but in effect, if you look at healthcare organisations, if you look at local government, if you look at the wider public sector, we are major employers. And it's just interested whether that strand, because I don't think we've quite worked out yet, certainly from an ICB point of view, where how we lead and take forward that anchor institution work. And it may even be there's more of a sense of doing this from a place perspective. I'm just thinking aloud, given the connection to the kind of agenda we were discussing earlier on.
Thank you both. Naomi, you'll be pleased to know that it is orientated around how do we enable people to be paid more. There is things in there around enabling people to pay less. We have identified that kind of anchor institution connectivity to this. Salford, in our conversation with them, identified the BBC. So they had BBC land in Media City, and they automatically made an assumption that that would provide increased opportunities for some of their children from the more deprived areas to get access into the BBC. Well, that didn't happen. Kids from Salford Crescent didn't end up with apprenticeships with the BBC. They've had to subsequently build an approach not dissimilar to the Anchor organisation stuff to actually compel the big players in their patch to actively contribute to some of this stuff. So I think it would be a valuable piece of work to probably play back through the Health and Wellbeing Board around how we connect that through.
Thank you. David?
I was just thinking about the mental health investment standard, which was a framework for getting more resource into mental health pegged to growth. So it had to increase year on year. And Stuart and I have been talking about emulating a prevention investment standard. So how would we commit partners to a year on year investment in anchor institution type behaviors and work? So not just limited to kind of the usual social value, 10% of procurement kind of from the local area, but actually going beyond that and saying of the 1.2 billion pounds that flows into health and care resources in the collective county, what's our expectation of the proportion of that should be dedicated to prevention, health inequalities type work? And if we agreed a kind of a baseline starting position, then we could grow that year on year, and it could be something that we expect partners to contribute to, similar to how we've grown investment in mental health by pegging it to a base standard. So that's just a view, and I think something we should probably think about.
It's a really good point, David. And I think what it also identifies is there's such a degree of commonality. So David, I think you mentioned the sustainability goals that the government has signed up to. The commonality that you see through those into what should be a more holistic approach to social value that isn't just about 10% around social value elements to your procurement really needs to be bottomed out. So it feels like that there are a whole host of agendas and language that's being used, which is orientated around the same thing, which for me is around how do we enable our big organisations to better contribute to some of our big priorities within our communities. And I think that's a specific piece of work that we need to pick up to identify that commonality of approach.
Thank you. Joe?
Thank you. Absolutely welcome this approach. I think it's very important, and I think this is a very pertinent time to be doing it. There are people who 6 months ago would not have considered themselves to be in poverty, but particularly when we're looking at utilities and fuel crisis, we have a whole emerging section of our population who have the potential to be unexpectedly plunged into poverty. This will be a changing situation, and we know that COVID, as with many major society events, will reorder the people who have advantages and disadvantages. So I would urge us to keep an eye on these shifting groups, and that some groups who have traditionally suffered may be joined, unfortunately, by other groups who have actually traditionally not been below the threshold. So I think there's a shifting population, but absolutely welcome it. Really good time to be talking about it and get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps we can take an action that will circulate it when we've just finished finessing the end product, not making it. Okay, thank you. So we have one more item, which is the housing strategy update, and we've got Jacqueline, if you. Yeah, just over to Stuart first.
Sorry, just to kind of give a bit of introduction, really. So in the context of the kind of journey that we're on as a health and wellbeing board, given that we have got our West Northants housing strategy being developed, we thought we might as well get into the habit of doing what we will be doing moving forward in the context of those wider determinants around enabling our housing colleagues to come along and start to engage with us around what that housing strategy development needs to look like. So this is the start of that process of broadening the scope of the Health and Wellbeing Board. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for giving me your time this afternoon just so I can go through the housing strategy. I know our colleague here has already heard this on Tuesday evening at scrutiny, so apologies. Absolutely.
Okay, so today really, just as Stuart says, to just give you an overview in terms of what we're trying to do, how we'd like to engage with stakeholders and partners, and also just to give you a flavour of some of the emergent issues that we've been speaking about with partners in terms of some validation workshops that have been taking place recently. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so just a quick presentation. Okay, so today we're just going to cover aspects of the strategy, some of the draft themes that from the evidence base that we've gathered in terms of, again, just our discussion about that, some emerging issues, and then the future work and the timeline for completing and having a draft approved housing strategy. So just quickly, as a local authority, as a new local authority, we felt it was really important that we have a housing strategy to direct and to provide leadership in terms of what we want, in terms of our priorities going forward, in terms of new housing development, in terms of how we're going to want to work with partners going forward, etc. So I think, although it's not a statutory requirement to have a housing strategy, I think it's a good document to have because, you know, being a new authority, you know, we've got RPs, developers who really want to know what do we want to deliver, where do we want to deliver, and what kind of homes we want to deliver as well, and also the services that we want our partners to operate within as well. So the housing strategy is not just about affordable housing, it's going to cover all tenures, so home ownership, private sector housing, etc. Because again, as we're a new authority, we felt that the strategy should just be probably a 2-year strategy in the first instance, just to give that overall direction, with the aim of then having a wider and longer term strategy after that time. I think during this presentation, it'd be clear as to why we think that's the best way to go because of evidence bases. We, you know, as I can see today, we've got these health and qualities work. Things will change. We've got new evidence bases coming forward. So I think let's start off with giving that direction, but then making that the information, the evidence base we have get stronger over the next couple of years to then have a real full-blown strategy after that. Again, as this strategy, we've worked obviously with the corporate plan and some of the key themes that we've drafted, obviously all aligned to that as well. And again, I think we need to think of all the other pieces of the work that are taking place to ensure this strategy aligns with some key pieces of work that I know is obviously happening as we speak. So next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what we've been doing as a team to date. So before Christmas, we tried to put together an evidence base. Now, some of the evidence comes from the 4 legacy authority areas. And I'm going to be honest with you, there are some big gaps in our database and in our evidence at the moment. And some of that is because of the data that's been gathered previously may have been gathered in different ways. We've gathered different data. So there's some lack of consistency in terms of what we've got there. And I'd be honest that as maybe district authorities, we probably didn't have a huge dialogue necessarily with our adult social care colleagues, our public health colleagues. And now I think as a unitary, there's a huge opportunity to work collectively and in collaboration together. So again, it's about working with, you know, with internal teams and external teams to try to get a better a landscape in terms of our evidence. And as I heard earlier in this meeting, as we all know, there's a change in landscape in terms of place-based modelling as well, in terms of the integrated care partnership system. And so we also need to think about that going forward. So I think over the next 2 years, hopefully we'll be in a much better position to understand how that integrated care system is going to work, how that place modelling is going to operate, and some of the evidence bases and the work that we do will probably be focused in those kind of areas as well. So we can think about services and delivery in a slightly different way as well. Okay, next slide, please. So, based on the evidence base we've gathered, we have drafted some 4 themes. Again, these are not set in stone, so they are, you know, we can change them as we go for consultation. So the first one is about delivering the homes that people need and can afford to live in. So this really is about how we meet future housing need from a development point of view and new additional homes. We know that as a local authority, we are working on a new strategic plan. So that will direct growth and development for the local authority over a plan period. And that is saying we're going to need to deliver over 64,000 homes over a plan period. of which 58% of that is going to need to be affordable housing. So that equates around about 1,200 homes a year. So as an authority and working with partners, we need to determine how do we deliver that scale of growth going forward. Where are they located? What services are we going to provide? So that's the basis of that first theme. The second theme is about improving quality, standard and safety of homes and housing services. Again, as a local authority, we own housing stock, and that's being managed by our Almo Northampton Partnership Homes. So we need to direct and we need to work in partnership with MPH in terms of the quality and standard that we offer as a landlord, as a provider of homes, but also the wider agenda in terms of what other partners are providing homes across West Northants. So we've got a couple of key largest registered providers, Grand Union Futures, and again, we need to work with them in terms of the quality and the quality of tenant services we provide, etc. And we also know there's some key legislation, regulatory legislation in terms of building safety. So dwellings over 18 metres high. Again, there's some real key responsibilities as a landlord that we need to take into account as well. The third theme is about enabling residents to live safe, healthy, independent and active lives. Again, this is, when we're building homes, when we're building communities in place, is how do we make sure those places and homes feel safe to the residents, and how can we encourage more independent living, working with adult social care colleagues, our health colleagues, etc. And so that's a key theme in terms of, we can build homes, but actually, how does it feel to live in them? Are they safe? Are people feeling supported, etc. And then the fourth theme is about supporting sustainable and thriving communities. One part of that is regarding the climate change agenda. And obviously that is a huge cost, and as a local authority in our corporate plan, we've said we try to deliver zero carbon by 2030. We know that's a huge ask of our partners and as a local authority, but how do we deliver that sustainably, not only in terms of our existing provision, but also for new developments as well? How do we focus that in the strategic plan in terms of how we want to deliver and build new homes as well? And then again, about thriving communities, and that really goes back to that place-based focus in communities and how, what provision, what service we provide and support for new communities and existing communities going forward. So those are the four draft themes that we have identified, and a golden thread throughout all of those, again, is about partnerships. And I think whatever priorities and objectives that are within this strategy, we're not going to be able to deliver that on our own. We need some really strong partnerships to enable us to do that. And I think the other thing is the financial viability, both from the delivery of new homes and affordable homes. We're going to have a whole shopping list of wants in terms of our new developments, and we need to understand what can we deliver as a local authority, and what partners and what levers can we bring in to deliver the things we want as well. So they're the four things. Okay. Next slide, please. I won't go into too much detail. This is really just linking the four themes I've just outlined and how they align to the corporate plan, just to show there is that linkage going through. Next slide, please. And so just so you know, over the last 6 weeks, we have been completing some validation workshops, so sharing some of the evidence base with colleagues. So we've met with our adult social colleagues, health colleagues. We had overview and scrutiny of people on Tuesday. So we've met with a number of different groups of people to understand what are the issues, what are their impacts, and potentially what could be the solutions and things that they'd like to see in the strategy and hooks in the strategy. And so I've just pulled together, and I wasn't planning to go through this in detail, but through information, some of the emergent issues that have come from those workshops and validation sessions. And so from the information we've gathered, we'll be consolidating and collating all of that together, and then we'll be going out for consultation and directing some real questions about some of the issues that have been raised and about what should be our priorities or and what are the potential solutions and options that we could consider going forward. So I wasn't really going into each of those unless you wanted me to, but I just thought I'd give that as information. So we've got some emergent issues regarding deliver homes that people need. Could I have the next slide, please? And then improving the quality standard and the safety homes. And again, you know, some of the key comments that have come out is about how we ensure consistency of service across the sector. Again, we've come from 4 different legacy areas and we're working in different ways. So try and making sure we bring that together and clear about what service we want to provide. There's some duplication across the area and across our partners. Again, how can we make that better? How can we reduce that duplication? Because obviously that's going to be a cost saving to us as well, but actually it won't be maybe a postcode lottery for residents, so that all is equality in terms of the service provider as well. Next slide. And so these are the emerging issues that have come from about for residents to live safe, healthy, independent lives. Some of the key conversations about how we work closer with our health and housing colleagues and adult social care. And some of that's already started in terms of co-location of services, working together to solve solutions, you know, households that got an issue. A lot of us are working with very similar customers and actually working together to actually provide some really, really good solutions and outcomes. Lots of conversations about care leavers, how do we support planned leave, you know, from care, and have a more collaborative approach in that. And again, I think the Unity Authority is helping us in terms of our conversations with the Children's Trust, etc. So I think there's huge opportunities to make sure we're able to deliver those kind of services going forward. And again, we need to recognise that we, as an authority, we've got a big rural and urban split as well. And services that we may provide in the rural areas will be very different to the ones we provide in the urban areas. And, you know, and there's different costs and challenges to both. So I think we all need to recognise that as well. And the last slide, please. And then the thriving and sustainable communities. Again, it links to the first one in terms of where we're delivering homes, but also because that also impacts on the environmental challenges as well. Okay, our homes close to employment and the service that we require as well, and things like that. And public realm being critical, you know, it's not just about number of homes, as I said earlier, it's about how we give support and involve residents in that. And so, yeah, there's a huge climate change conversation I think we need to have and how we deliver some of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the timeline, the data validation is completed. So we've got the evidence base and we've undertaken those stakeholder workshops. So over the next few weeks, I'm going to be putting all of that information together, and with the hope to go out for formal consultation in mid-April for 6 weeks. And then the timeline is that we have a drafted strategy for Cabinet in July. So that is the timeline as of today. So as I said, the consultation will not be on a draft strategy. We think it's much more effective if we pose directed questions and get views of people. And then that obviously in terms of looking at solutions and the options, and people can then comment on that rather than a drafted strategy. So that is the plan. And alongside those questions, we will be also providing an overview of some of the evidence bases, so we can link as to why we've got those 4 themes and the reasons why we're asking those particular questions. So that is the next piece of work.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Is there any comments or questions from David?
It's great, well done. Looks really exciting, and you clearly thought about all the big issues that are part of it. On one of the slides that you skipped over, I just saw the reference to the community infrastructure levy, or some reference to development kind of resources.
Yes.
Can you just maybe just
Yeah.
infer how we're going to use that bit of legislation and tackle some of the health inequality stuff.
Yeah, I think we just need, again, for SIL, we need to, as a local authority, determine what our priorities are going to be and what's going to be our shopping list, because we can say we want, for infrastructure, for education, things like that. But obviously, we just need to understand how that works in terms of viability of a scheme as well. We also want to deliver 40% affordable housing on schemes. We're not necessarily as authority going to be able to deliver all. Some of that, though, if we can't deliver it through SIL, is how we can involve our partners to leave us some of that money in as well.
Yeah, I guess it's just 64,000 people or homes?
Homes.
I mean, that's a couple of GP practices easily. So it's just kind of thinking through how do we collectively use the resources that come through from development funds and use them in a health and well-being context. And I accept the school's point that we've got to think about all the things, but yeah, it's just.
But I think that's important, though. We are engaging with the strategic plan, and that was one of the strategic plan is due to hopefully be adopted, I think, around about spring 2024. And so obviously this strategy is going to be for 2 years. So actually it works really well. A new strategy would then dovetail into that new strategic plan. So that's why it makes sense to have that 2-year strategy at the moment, just to give that initial focus and direction. And then obviously the strategic plan will come on board and a new housing strategy as well after that.
Thank you. Toby?
A minor confession and then a kind of comment or question. The confessional bit, I started life as a town planner, so I still have an amateur, more than a passing amateur interest in the built environment. And the serious comment bit, there's a really strong stack of evidence around the impact of physical environments on health and on not just physical health, but also in terms of mental well-being, in terms of mood, in terms of kind of anxiety, in terms of depression. And I don't know to what extent, because I'm entirely out of touch with planning these days, whether there's any scope in local areas to do anything in that kind of space, both in terms of physical design of buildings and space and daylight, but also in terms of building materials and the impact of building materials on physical health, respiratory conditions, and so on. So a comment just to see if there's any scope locally to do anything in that kind of arena, as well as we often rightly focus on the kind of environmental impact of built environment, etc. But there's a big health strand there and a really strong evidence base, which I'm sure public health colleagues, public health started out in terms of kind of housing and sewerage and clean water, and it's that kind of territory, isn't it? Thanks.
I think as from a strategic plan point of view, we can as a local authority say we want to adopt minimum space standards, because we know some big developers, they're very small rooms, and obviously that's, having more space outdoors and indoors actually obviously going to have an impact on somebody's health and well-being as well. So I think that's why it's so important. This strategy gives some sort of levers and some direction in terms of strategic plan of where we want to go as well as a local authority, and some of the things that planning can help us do as well in terms of that.
Thank you. Bob?
I was just going to come in on the strategic plan because I think it is too place-centred and not people-centred enough. There's not enough about how we build communities. And I mean, we're in a consultation phase. I think it's very important that all agencies, particularly the people agencies, kind of push the thing towards being more people-centred and less architect-centred and developer-centred, if you like. But that's just my personal view. But I think we're not there in this area at the moment.
Joe.
That was set up beautifully. I want to build on Councillor Professor's comments. I think it is about what those people need, and I'm assuming within this there will be a breakdown of the types of homes, the types of services people may need. I know that some schools are struggling with capacity. If we're building family homes, I'm assuming there will be children. If we're looking at places that are adapted, they will need access to health, but also looking at mobility. I'm assuming that you're looking at what are the other infrastructure requirements if you're building a particular type of or a mix of estate. What are those other things, and will that be brought into the consultation?
We will talk about in terms of the numbers and what's going to be required, but I think in terms of the infrastructure needs, that really does fit within the strategic plan. in terms of that that planning part of it. This is not a plan and document, it's a housing strategy. So I think we can highlight where we think the needs are and what we think is going to need to come forward. But that's why I think this then needs to feed into that strategic plan to ensure that happens in terms of services and provision going forward. But we can also, in that meantime, obviously, if there is a need, look to start commission services if we feel if there's particular needs. But in terms of the infrastructure, that would have to come through that planning system.
And if I may, not wishing to anticipate Colin's point, the primary care and the wider primary care, which obviously then fits within a lot of the work that's going to be happening with the ICB. So not only general practice, but pharmacy, dentist, optoms, available on the NHS, which I appreciate is an enormous challenge, probably more my challenge than necessarily local authority, but it's looking at those services and being very mindful that the timescales for local authority and the timescales for health are always horribly mismatched, and we haven't found the 6,000 GPs yet.
Colin.
So I actually did pick up on some of my points, but the question I was going to ask is, what about existing development? Because we've had cases before us where developers have come in, said they're going to do X amount of development, Section 106 money, but it's never enough. Are you going to review things that are in process, or is it just new developments going forwards?
I think there's a bit of a mixed match between what we can do in terms of the housing strategy and what planners can do. Obviously, in terms of new developments and what's being provided, that's very much a planning, development management issue that we need to resolve. And obviously the Section 106 side of things is part of that as well. I think what we can do is direct and highlight what is needed across the authority and what levers we can bring in, etc. I don't, this then would then feed into development. So obviously as a team, we are negotiating in terms of affordable housing, what we need on sites anyway on a week day-to-day basis. But in terms of overall development, that's really very much planning led and planning policy led.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Sally?
I just wanted to make a couple of points. So just to pick up on Toby's point, you're absolutely right. It's so important we build the sort of health outcomes through the strategic planning process. So we need to work on that. And I know I don't need to say this in this room because you're all, I can tell from the questions, but basically the work that Jacqueline's doing, it is so important in relation to health outcomes. A baby today living in a horrible damp HMO is not going to get their best start in life, he's not going to get, so this work is so important to this board basically, and just thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Sally. And Will, I noticed your thumb was up then. Was you agreeing with something or you wanted to make a point?
No, that I think that I haven't deliberately raised my thumb.
Okay. Well, at least I noticed anyway. Okay, well, thank you, Jacqueline. That was, oh, sorry, Olivia.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, we from the Children's Trust really welcome the joint working around the housing strategy, and really welcome the fact that there's some focus on care leavers. I just don't want us to lose focus on 16 and 17-year-old homeless young people as well, who are not care leavers, because they're also really important. And the interface as well with other projects such as the Staying Close project for care leavers, which should fall into some of the housing strategy as well. So I think it's great that communication is happening.
Thank you. Right, I think everybody's
Thank you.
made their points. So thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was really valuable in terms of the wider conversations we've had today. And thank you.
Thank you.
Good. And that is the last item on the agenda today. So I'm going to thank everybody. And I'll make a point of thanking you guys from the Health and Wellbeing Forums for coming along, and for Will to staying with us on the screen there. I think we've had a really, really good, rich meeting with a lot of really valuable insights and inputs from everybody. So I want to thank everybody, and the next meeting is in June, which, God help us. There's a lot to happen between now and June, is there? But thank you, everyone. Really appreciate everybody coming out today. Thank you.